It's happening now. So anything you say will go.
Yes, yes.
Just trying to determine whether there's any audio. Are you muted? No, you're not muted. I would, your hearing test, I would do your audio settings. Through this, didn't I? Yes, I would put your audio settings up on your laptop. Maybe because you have your laptop muted. Is there any way to put your laptop in another room? Yeah. It's working, right? We're picking up my voice over there. Yeah.
Good evening. I'd like to invite you to this evening where we are going to be discussing possibility for ceasefire in Ukraine. As you all know, this has been an endless war with already 500,000 casualties. Is it more helpful to continue it, risking nuclear apocalypse and guaranteeing impediment to addressing climate change? Or should we demand a ceasefire, negotiation, and a commitment to sending no more weapons? This evening, we are going to have a public discussion, not a debate. We will have 4 speakers right here. David Swanson will be speaking first, then Helen Coffin. After that, Ray McGovern, and finishing up the evening will be Medea Benjamin. They are each going to speak for 10 minutes, after which time you will have a break. I'm sorry. Yes, well, no. We'll have 10 minutes for each speaker, and then Helena will speak with you about a very important subject. And after that, each speaker will have 5 more minutes to respond to each other and to discuss it. After that time, we will have a question and answer period. If you would raise your hand if you'd like to speak. If Tucker who's back there, will come with a microphone, and you will have 1 minute to ask a question. No speeches, please, only questions. Please direct those questions to the speaker that you would like to answer. So I believe that that's it. We can go right into the evening and begin with David Swanson. David Swanson is a longtime Charlottesville resident, former board member of Charlottesville Center for Peace and Justice, the co-founder and executive director of WorldBeyondWar.org, campaign coordinator of TruthAction.org, and a host of Talk World Radio. He's the author of 12 books, some of which will be available after the discussion on war and peace. David Swanson.
Thank you, Sarah Klansman, all for being here. War and peace could be a very simple issue. We make it very complicated. People say and do things that I simultaneously want to cheer for and condemn. This week, Senator Rand Paul said he wants to stop supporting Ukraine in order to support the United States. This phrase, support Ukraine, is shorthand for fueling a war that is destroying Ukraine, damaging the world, and threatening nuclear apocalypse. Support Ukraine means keeping the weapons flowing in combination with the insistence that the weapons will keep coming as long as Ukraine agrees not to make peace. Some of the money goes to things other than weapons. And rather bizarrely, people find this particularly offensive. It's one thing to fund senseless mass murder and quite another to fund human needs. That is outrageous. But on the television show this week, 60 Minutes, it's the opposite of outrageous. The aid to Ukraine, as this show depicts it, is funding good capitalist entrepreneurs with startup money And yes, some of it goes to tanks, but tanks are purely protective devices like armor that save lives because the soldiers inside them can't get shot or blown up with mines. The irony that these Bradley fighting vehicles exist to kill and destroy is completely and intentionally lost. There's no bragging about body counts here, just rehearsed gratitude to the brave American people. Polling is the same. A rapidly increasing percentage of the US public, a majority in some polls and a plurality in all polls, wants to stop supporting or aiding Ukraine. But what does that mean? What if I want to help Ukraine? What if I consider Ukrainians, and for that matter, Somalis and Yemenis, Syrians and Venezuelans, to be exactly as important as US residents? What if I want the US government to drop its opposition to peace talks and drop its commitment to sending more weapons, but to send the whole world, including Ukraine and including the United States itself, vastly more in actual humanitarian aid? What if aiding Hawaiians is not more important than slaughtering Ukrainians because of what passports Hawaiians have, but because killing Ukrainians isn't supporting or aiding or helping Ukrainians at all? We live in a very strange age in which spending money on death and destruction is understood as philanthropy, in which the US government badgers other governments to spend more money on weapons as a percentage of their economies, as if weapons are a public good, a service that global citizens must provide. Once you have internalized this idea that militarism is good for you, even though it leads to wars, and even though a tiny percentage of that money could eliminate poverty or create a Green New Deal beyond the wildest fantasies of Green New Dealers, and once you've committed your mind to believing that victory is eternally imminent and that the enemy is a monstrous and magical threat to the mysterious force of freedom, even as Ukraine bans elections and opposition parties and free speech, and the US Democratic Party effectively eliminates presidential primaries, it's only going to confirm your commitment to war when you see that the only Congress members who oppose it tend to be selfish hypocrites pushing voodoo economics. Rand Paul wants to hoard all the resources for this 4% of humanity. On top of which, he's lying because we know he no more wants to spend a dime on Hawaiians, Virginians, or anybody else than he does on Ukrainians. But if Ilhan Omar won't oppose so-called aiding Ukraine, while Ron Paul and Henry Kissinger and Donald Trump will, can there be any question which position is the one for a good, caring person? Yeah, as a matter of fact, there can be. Does anybody remember learning about the error of argument from authority? Are we not practically conditioned to shout, follow the science? Don't we claim to value independent thought? Doesn't UVA still teach that bit of Jefferson about the need for an informed populace? Well, what all of that stuff means is that something isn't true because of who agrees with it, but because it actually makes sense to you as a responsible thinking person. The war in Ukraine, both sides quietly admit, while shouting the opposite, is an endless quagmire. And if you, I'm not going to come anywhere close to finishing. Never mind, I'll try. And if you believe either side's fantasy about total victory, please consider how such a victory could possibly be lasting, sustainable, or just. This is a war over not allowing the people of Crimea and Donbass to choose their own fate. That is the opposite of democracy. And neither success nor failure for whichever side you're on would last, even if it were in any way likely to happen. This war ends with compromise or with nuclear apocalypse. Risky nuclear apocalypse is insane. While being normal and accepted practice, independent thinking means rejecting. This war is the top impediment to global cooperation on climate and environment, and a top direct destroyer of the environment. It is the top force shifting resources worldwide into militarism. It is the justification for spying on everything we do and curtailing rather than expanding our rights. It teaches bigotry and dehumanization. And it teaches exactly contrary to what we teach our children, but in perfect alignment with thousands of movies on Netflix and Amazon that compromises evil, that holding out for total destruction of someone else is admirable, and that violence solves problems. Have we ever really come to grips with the fact that less than 3% of US military spending would end starvation on Earth? Military spending is so enormous that fractions of it could transform the world, including the United States. There is no need for this selfish choosing of us or them. And actually aiding the world would generate many fewer enemies than bombing it. Unlike normal countries, the US counts as 40% of its so-called foreign aid weapons for foreign militaries. The biggest recipients, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Israel, and Egypt. And yet, as a percentage of income, many other countries' actual foreign aid is greater than that of the United States, weapons included. Maybe we should frown a little on all the free weapons for Egypt because a senator has gold bars in his closet for making that happen. But have we forgotten Congress members bragging about what they would earn from weapons stocks on Wall Street through fueling the war in Ukraine? Have we forgotten that opposing free weapons for Israel will earn you a well-funded primary challenger and banishment from committees and television appearances? It's not all about gold bars. In fact, in a system of legalized campaign bribery, Saudi-funded think tanks, Pentagon-funded movies and video games and pre-game celebrations, and revolving doors between weapons dealers, media outlets, and so-called public service, gold bars are more of an indication of stupidity than of any unusual level of corruption. War and peace can be a simpler question. Mass murder is evil. It's evil when Russia does it. It's evil when the US does it. It's evil when Ukraine does it. Compromise and peace have always been possible and preferable. It just gets harder the longer a war drags on. And that is a dangerous trend when the alternative is nuclear escalation. Allowing the people in the disputed territories to choose their own fate is democratic. Drafting people into mandatory barbarism and imprisoning those who object, as both Russia and Ukraine do, is the opposite of democracy. The US is party to fewer major human rights treaties than any other nation on earth, is the greatest saboteur of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, the greatest abuser of the veto in the UN. And yes, Zelensky's right to want it gone. The greatest violator of treaties related to war and peace and disarmament, the most frequent shredder of treaties it had been party to, the greatest violator of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, standing outside the landmines, arms trade, and cluster munitions treaties, the top weapons dealer, coup trainer, and by many measures, earth destroyer, want to shut up about the rules-based order and catch up with those who support one, including the 47 nations that have pushed the United Nations for peace negotiations in Ukraine.
Our next speaker is Helena Collin. For many years, Helena was a Charlottesville resident. She's the founder and CEO of Just World Book and Just World Educational. And currently, she writes essays as Global. You pronounce that, Helena? Globalities.org. She has been a journalist for many years, including 7 years in Lebanon during the Civil War, reporting for the Christian Science Monitor, BBC, and other platforms. She has published 7 books on international issues and conflict resolution. Some of these books will be available also after the event. Welcome, Helena Collin, please.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody here who helped to organize this. It's been a really wonderful experience. We working with old friends from Charlottesville and new friends. I hope to thank you all for coming. David has given us a fabulous general picture of US hypocrisy and evils of militarism. I don't think probably for this audience, but I need to spell out the many casualties and losses that the continuing carnage in Ukraine is imposing on humanity. Not only carnage imposed on the people in Ukraine, the people scattered from Ukraine, the people in Russia and elsewhere in Europe, but also globally, not only bringing us to the brink of nuclear war, but also impeding efforts, as David said, to address climate crisis that is already with us, not just a threat. This madness has to end. People say that it's too hard, it's too complicated. You know, there's issues to do with the Donbass, issues to do with Crimea, issues to do with NATO's enlargement, issues to do with the forces in Europe, and how do we address all these issues? Yes, there are a lot of issues, and they cannot all be resolved overnight. That's true. But you don't need to resolve all the outstanding issues in order to have a ceasefire. I have lived for 6 years in a country at war, and I know, I can tell you viscerally and vividly how much any situation of war impacts on civilian populations, women, children, caregivers. This carnage has to end, and it can be ended without resolving all the outstanding issues if you use the simple mechanism called an armistice. Now, you know that commentatoriat in this country loves to talk about weapons systems and this and that, and weapons and whatever. We really don't know much about diplomatic history. How many people here have an idea what an armistice is? Yeah, a good portion, because this is a well-educated audience, but an armistice is a special kind of a ceasefire. In any kind of a war, you'll have maybe a local ceasefire or temporary ceasefire in order to evacuate wounded people or to open a particular humanitarian pathway. An armistice is a total ceasefire of all the fighting front. It has a monitoring mechanism that is agreed. And it always comes with some mechanism for further peace talks that will address the outstanding issues. So historically, some important armistices that you might remember are the one that ended the First World War. Until recently, we used to celebrate Armistice Day, November the 11th, ending just a terrible carnage in Europe that is so similar to the carnage that even Ukraine is seeing today. And so that happened in November of 1918, and the following year, there was a final peace agreement. And in fact, it carried on. There was Versailles, there was all kinds of things, maybe 3 years to resolve all the outstanding issues, and they were not well resolved, as we know. But there was an armistice in 1918, another armistice, really important, the one that ended the Arab-Israeli Wars of 1948. So that armistice, which was overseen by the United Nations, is still in force on the Syrian-Israeli and Lebanese-Israeli frontiers. So there are periodic clashes, escalations, or whatever, but the armistice fundamentally has held. In the case of Jordan and Egypt, the armistice of 1949 was translated into a final peace, and that is what you always hope for an armistice. It doesn't always happen. The other very famous outstanding armistice today is the one in Korea, which was actually reached 70 years ago, last July, and it has held for 70 years without being transformed into a final peace agreement. The armistice in 1953 in Korea brought to an end a terrible carnage. I mean, there were millions of people killed in the Korean War. And there have been some outbursts of violence since then, but not a lot. And in fact, there's a big pro-peace party in South Korea that, sends delegations to North Korea, and unfortunately, it got overturned by more hawkish party at the last election with the support of the US government, which supported the hawkish party. But there is a possibility there could be a final peace. And even if there isn't a final peace, the situation of armistice is far better for the people of South Korea and North Korea than a continuation of the fighting could ever possibly have been. In fact, I've never been to South Korea, but I love to watch South Korean things on the television. There's a great series called Crash Landing on You, which is, if you haven't seen it, you should see it. It's about a South Korean heiress who goes on a kind of a paragliding tour, and then there's like a windstorm, and she ends up in North Korea. And anyway, it's really well done and interesting. But they have such lively culture as well as economics and lots of interesting things going on in South Korea and in North Korea as well. Although we get all the kind of anti-North Korean propaganda in this country. But if you see pictures of Pyongyang, if you see pictures of the rail system, there is quite a, let's say, a sort of mid-1960s vibe to the economic development of North Korea, a whole lot better than it was in 1952, which incidentally was the year that I was born. So, I mean, it's lasted a long time, I can tell you, that armistice. So why should I say that this is important for Ukraine? The reason is you do not have to resolve all the issues. You can just agree to stop the fighting. And it has benefits. Another interesting thing about the Korean armistice of 1953 that not many people seem to know. Who were the parties who signed the armistice? The parties were the United States, China, and North Korea. Anybody see who's missing from the list? South Korea. South Korea never signed. They didn't want it. The strongman Syngman Lee was vehemently opposed, but the folks in Washington said, it's time. We've got to stop the fighting. They didn't say, oh, we have to wait and let Syngman Lee come to his own conclusion. I think that's really important regarding Ukraine. If we as a country and our leaders consider that this war is not in our interests or the interests of global humanity, we could conclude a ceasefire with the Russians under some auspices within a very short period of time. And the Ukrainians may, as the South Koreans did, be kicking and screaming, but what are they going to do? Without US, NATO, European support. They will come along just as South Korea did. And actually, I think a large proportion of the Ukrainian people would be just delighted to be able to go back to their homes and rebuild their communities in the way that the South Koreans and North Koreans were able to do after the armistice was reached there. So I'll just end with a quick story about 1916. In 1916, the middle of that horrible carnage known as the First World War, the leaders of Germany, France, and Britain all realized that their countries could not maintain the fighting, could not win, and that the human losses were just unbearable. So what did they do? They all separately, well, actually, the French and British did it together, but then the Germans were separate for obvious reasons. They reached out to President Woodrow Wilson and asked him to intervene to conclude a ceasefire, seeing that they couldn't do it themselves because all of them had, until then, maintained this kind of robust pro-war propaganda for their populace. And they couldn't say, oops, that was all a terrible mistake. Sorry about that. Let's just have a ceasefire. But they reached out to Woodrow Wilson to say, put some pressure on us so that we can reach that ceasefire. Now, sadly, he didn't do that. We know the next 2 years were terrible, but that's another story. Right now, I think we need to build the pressure from the grassroots in this country to urge our government to go for a ceasefire, a complete ceasefire known as an armistice in Ukraine. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ray McGovern. Ray is a longtime peace activist and author who spent 27 years as a CIA analyst, whose duties included sharing national intelligence estimates and preparing and delivering the president's daily brief. He is co-creator of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. He has taught Russian as an adjunct at the University of Virginia. Please welcome Ray McGovern.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
How about now? I feel very good to be back in my adopted state, Commonwealth. 55 years here, Northern Virginia. We live in Raleigh now, North Carolina. I'm trying to get the pronunciation right so I can blend in with the indigenous. It was an interesting ride up today, partly because there was some rain, but mostly because, as most of you know, it was George Gershwin's birthday. So this wonderful classical radio station had all manner of good things on. It was a joy. I didn't care how much it rained. And so that was one anniversary today. I'd like to talk about two more and their relationship to what we need to do in order to get our betters, our leaders, to wise up and seek a ceasefire and an armistice. One has to do with another anniversary today. A year ago, what happened? You know? Anybody?
Yes.
What happened? Yeah, please.
Nord Stream.
Nord Stream, right. We blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. Now, there's no doubt about who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, okay? Give me a break. A doctor who was operating on some skin cancer for me says, hey, Mr. McGovern, I understand it was the Ukrainians that did it. And I was, not ready for that. So that's BS. And then I realized, so that's BS to a doctor. And he took off a couple more layers. Anyhow, why was the thing blown up? Well, we know how well it was advertised. I'd like to turn your attention to what happened after it. Our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, got up and said, what a wonderful, marvelous thing this was, because this way Europe will never become totally, very much dependent on Russian gas or oil. So this thing that we've been striving for decades, finally we did it, or it happened. He didn't say we did it. Well, I found out a month ago that Tony Blinken went to Harvard, and he studied under a Russophobe that wouldn't quit. His name was Richard Pipes. He trained a whole bunch of Harvard people to hate Russia. It was a Pole, and he wrote his dissertation, that as Blinken did, on ally versus ally, America, Europe, and the Siberian pipeline crisis. I didn't know that, so I ordered the book. Cost me $90. It was worth it. I didn't have a chance to read it all, but I looked in the index. Thankfully, the index was good. And I looked for Richard Pipes. There were about 5 citations I'm gonna read you one or two, because it shows that these people, not only Lincoln, but people like Fiona Hill, studied under Richard Pipes and the rest of them. Here's what he says on page 103. Richard Pipes, this is Lincoln right here. He said, he was a national security advisor. He said, frankly, quote, "We have no reason to be continually deferring, as has been done in the past, to the Europeans. We always humor them, and they never humor us. Enough is enough." Then later he says, Richard Pipes said that when Gorbachev came into power, the Soviet elite has no interest in reform. They're a privileged class, and they'll maintain their monopoly on power. Now, Gorbachev had come in, so Lincoln made note of that. Well, Gorbachev says that he wants to have the creation of the freedom to create. And then he adds, now, while it is naive to believe that a well-tailored suit and a facility to charm the world media are signs of a reformer. Well, that was Gorbachev. Of course, he was the real deal. And the Russian government fell apart, Soviet government, without anybody being killed, all right? So these people have been trained to hate Russia, and by the best that Harvard has to offer, I say that advisedly, and of course, Fiona Hill, I'm gonna pass this around because she had a New York Times op-ed in January of last year. Title was, "Putin has the United States right where it wants." And the front page has a picture of the 5 most recent and the current president, with Putin waving goodbye to them. And the subtext is, this time, Putin's aim is bigger than closing NATO's open door to Ukraine. He wants to evict the United States from Europe. As he might put it, goodbye, America. Don't let the door kick you on the way out. Here's the 3 presidents who can circulate around. Now, what's my point in all this? My point in all this is to say that on this anniversary, when the pipeline was blown up, curiously enough, we need to mark just one other anniversary, and this happened 40 years ago, not 1 year ago, but 40. Anyone know who Stanislav Petrov was? He was a light colonel in the Soviet Army, and he came on duty at their watch thing to see, all the alarms going off, 5 US intercontinental ballistic missiles being shut off from the Midwest, and everything was going haywire. What did he do? He looked at them. He said, wait, I'm not gonna interrupt just yet, because I've learned that computers don't always tell the right story, and let's make this. He waited for 5 minutes, and then he waited 5 minutes more. And then he said, if there were an attack, the United States is not going to use 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so finally, as he said, he decided it was a false alarm. Now, this was deciding rather late, because there was no way the Russians could have retaliated for that false alarm. He said, I did it because I didn't rely on computers. Humans are smarter than computers. Period, end quote. He died 5 years ago. Okay. Now, humans are smarter than computers. Right now, our computer reaction to a strategic nuclear strike doesn't have time for humans to become involved. Okay. So that's how perilous this is. That's how perilous it is. I feel very close to Petrov because he's a contemporary. He was born 6 days after World War I. Sorry. World War II started, okay? And I was born 6 days before Hitler drove his tanks into Poland, okay? We're 12 days apart, okay? And I asked myself, you know, if the way I was ingrained in hatred for Russia was such that I was put in the position of Petrov, how would I have reacted? Knowing how unreliable computers are, would I still have done the courageous thing and said, wait, I'm gonna make sure this is the real deal? I don't know. And so what's my bottom line here? The cultivation of this Russophobia, which started back when we accused the Russians erroneously of hacking into the DNC computers. I was told by somebody earlier tonight that Hillary Clinton still believes that to be the case. There's sworn testimony that is absolutely not the case. So we've blacked Russia now for 7, 8 years. People are willing to go to war against this evil Russians for no damn good reason. So what's the solution here? Well, we got to face up to the fact that we are responsible for the devastation, the killing in Ukraine. What proportion of the blame do we have? Well, I've been saying 103%. I said that spontaneously after some sort of meeting we had. And I said, why did I say, oh, I know why I said 3%. Because 6 weeks after that war started, Putin had achieved his objective. The next day, after he started, he said, we want to talk. Putin had scared the Ukrainians to say, look, I mean business. Neutrality. Don't keep shelling people in Donbass. We need an agreement, okay? And guess what, folks? There was an agreement. Anybody know about the agreement? 31 March, there was an agreement. All these things, okay? Last thing I'll say is that agreement was put the kibosh on by the fellow we sent from London, Boris Johnson, to sabotage it. So what I'm saying here is we need, as a nation, to do a confession, to have what the monastic people used to call a chapter of faults. Acknowledge our guilt here, and then make sure enough Americans know this so that they won't tolerate the killing of another 500,000 Ukrainians. Yeah, that's what I mean. 500, do that again. 500, oh, that's all right. Okay, last thing I'll say is 500,000, what does that remind you of? Madeleine Albright, maybe? When she was asked by Leslie Stahl? Iraqi children under the age of 5, 500,000 dead. Is that worth it? Yeah, it's worth it. Is it worth keeping this up? We Americans are better than that. We got to call a halt to this. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ray. Our next speaker is Medea Benjamin. Medea is the co-author of War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. She is also co-founder of the women-led group Vote Inc. and co-founder of the human rights group Global Exchange, as well as a member of the advisory board of WorldBeyondWar. She is the author of 10 additional books on war and peace. Some of them will be available out in the hall after today. Please welcome Medea Benjamin.
I've been doing a lot of traveling in the last year with this book, War in Ukraine, because I've been appalled at how the narrative that's being spun by the media and by our politicians is so devoid of context for how this war came about. And what I found is probably what many of you find in your own families, communities, organizations. so much division among people who we thought we were on the same page with in terms of understanding the war is not the answer. Raise your hand if you've had those kind of discussions with people. It's really been quite heartbreaking to find people in our communities that don't understand that this is another endless war, a war that is unwinnable on the battlefield, and a war where solutions have to be found. We are called Putin apologists. And I start out always by saying, I condemn this war on all kinds of levels, being illegal, being immoral, being brutal, that if I lived in Russia, I think I would be in prison for protesting this war, but we still get called Putin apologists. And I have found in traveling around this country that my talks have been canceled at universities, at bookstores, at peace churches, just like a United Church of Christ where I was canceled in upstate New York. It is really astounding that people don't even want these conversations to happen. And so that's why I think education is so important. But it also is organizing. I think, David, you started out by talking about how the Republicans are the ones that are questioning this war. And it does feel quite strange when you look at Congress and you see that people who are saying what you consider to be the most insane things about this war are people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and Matt Gaetz and people who we probably don't agree with on all kinds of other issues. And so that's why it's important organizing communities where we do feel an affinity. And one of those where we thought it was important is in the faith-based community. Last year, before the holiday season, we thought, okay, in this difficult atmosphere, let's see if we can get 100 faith-based leaders to sign a call for a truce. And instead of 100, we ended up getting 1,400 faith-based leaders. Faith-based newspapers asking people to be supporting the Pope's efforts to find peaceful solutions. We're also next week going to be having an interfaith prayer service right in the middle of the Senate lobby, again, to show the people in Congress there are people of different faiths who are coming together to say we need to find a way to go from the battlefield to the negotiating table. The other important community to reach were mayors, because we know from going around our cities the terrible needs that exist, and got the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which represents all of the major cities throughout this country, to pass a resolution saying we need those funds to improve the lives of people in our cities. We want you to find a negotiated solution. The other thing we have been doing is forming a coalition called Peace in Ukraine. We're passing around a sign-up sheet for World Beyond War that we hope will share with Peace in Ukraine, because it's important to stay in touch with you, because we are doing so many things. For example, around the media, if any of you like to write, we have a wonderful group that is responding to what we consider very propaganda-like pieces that are coming out in the media, just like the PBS piece that just came out 60 Minutes, where it was really like it could have been done by the Pentagon, and it certainly is for the Pentagon. And we launched a campaign today to say that we want PBS to do another piece calling about the urgency for diplomacy. And then the issue of Congress, how much we have to do to be pushing our members of Congress. It was quite remarkable that in October of last year, there was a letter that was being passed around by the Democrats saying, in addition to the money that you are giving for weapons and for economic aid, we would like you to also start negotiations. Well, they only could get 30 members of the Democratic Congress to sign that very, very mild letter. And within 24 hours, it was so pilloried by their own party that they withdrew the letter, and since then have been basically silent about this war. There are 19 of them that came out against cluster bombs. It seemed like that weapon was a little too much for them. but they have been voting for every tranche of money for more money for the war. And now there is $24 billion in addition that Biden is asking for. So far, we've been spending $223 million every day for this war in Ukraine. And Biden is asking for more. And that will be coming up for a vote. So we have to call our members of Congress and tell them that we want them to be advocating for diplomacy, not more ways to fuel this conflict. The Democrats have been against proposals for auditing where the money is going, for an inspector general to be looking at how the funds are being used. There was an amendment that I considered the most logical amendment that said, it was proposed by a member of the Freedom Caucus of the Republican Party, but it said, we want a report from you within 90 days. We want you to tell us, what is your definition of victory? We don't know. Is it Russians going back to where things were in 2014? Is it Russians going back to where things were when they invaded on February 22nd? Or is it getting rid of Putin? And we want to know what your diplomatic path is and what this is going to cost us. There were 129 Republicans who signed on to this. How many Democrats? Zero Democrats. So we have a lot of work in pushing our members of Congress. Tomorrow night, some of us have a meeting with Barbara Lee, the one person who still rests on her laurels for 20 years ago, voting against going to war after 9/11, but has been voting for money and more money and more money for this war. Bernie Sanders, who has been very good on saying that we need to end the war in Yemen, we need to cut the Pentagon's budget. He has been a great advocate for this war in Ukraine, and he has chastised those 30 Democrats who signed that letter, which is why next week on October 4th, there are members of his state in Vermont who are coming down to Washington, D.C., many of us joining them. We hope some of you could, to do a sit-in in Bernie Sanders' office and say, it's time for you to go back to your the presidential candidates are giving us some space to talk more about this issue. There are presidential candidates from all different parties who are coming out with a good position on this war. You might not like the candidate, but it's good that their positions are being heard. And that goes from Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis to Robert F. Kennedy to Cornel West. And then globally, we have been working with our friends in Europe who are really feeling the blowback from this war because of the sanctions on Russia that are reverberating in the economy of Europe. And we had a meeting this summer in Vienna where 32 countries were represented, where we talked together, exchange ideas about how we're going to mobilize in our communities. And we continue to be working with the Europeans. And then finally, there is the global community. And sometimes when we might feel a little bit alone in doing this work, recognize that we are part of the global majority. And if you had a chance to listen to any of the speeches that were happening this last week at the United Nations, it was quite inspiring because country after country, the leaders got up there and talked about this war. And I want to end by quoting some of Gustavo Petro, who's the president of Colombia. He said, the minutes are ticking on, defining life or death on our planet. And rather than talking about how to defend life in the future, we are deciding instead to waste our time and money killing one another. We are not thinking about how to expand life on a burning planet, but rather how to end life. Latin America is being called to produce more war machines, more men, and sending them to the killing fields. They're forgetting that our country's been invaded several times by the very same people who are now talking about combating invasion. They're forgetting that for oil, Iraq was invaded, Syria was invaded, Libya was invaded. They're forgetting that the same reasons they use today to defend Zelensky are those very reasons which should be deployed to defend Palestine. They forget that to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, all wars must be brought to an end. But they're helping to wage one war in particular in Ukraine because the large superpowers see this as suiting themselves. But what is the difference between Ukraine and Palestine? Is it not time to bring an end to both wars and other wars too, and to make the most of the short time we have on this planet. Thank you.
Before we go into next, where the speakers all can respond and have 5 minutes, I would like to, Helena would like to speak about a very important subject.
So first of all, I want to thank everybody in the local organization here, Sarah and David and Roy Hange and Adele Ruth and Chip Tucker. It has been our pleasure to work together to invite Medea and Ray with us. And so thank you to all of you. This did take quite a lot of work to pull together, but guess what? It also takes money to do this work. So that's my special message is lead sponsor of tonight's discussion has been World Beyond War. So we're asking you to please support World Beyond War's work on this and other anti-war campaigns, which you can do by giving at this webpage. And Adele, can I ask you to take a basket and Rima, maybe a basket each of you around? So in the basket, you will find a QR code. I ask everybody who's here tonight to consider either put some money into the basket or take out the QR code and give when you're at home. Okay, got it? Very simple.
We should say that we do have a lot of advertising costs. We have spent quite a bit of money trying to reach people, bring them into this event. We'll have not covered all of our expenses. So we appreciate anything you can donate.
And there will also be the publication sale afterwards, but this is the covered cost. And we can go on while we down the Rima take time. I'm sorry. Like a poet.
Okay, so now we're going to go to the wild dance program. We can keep going, right?
Oh, thank you.
All right, thank you. So we'll go to the next part and we'll ask David Swanson to come up with a response to any of the other speakers. He has 5 minutes.
My response to all the other speakers is applause. Very well done. If I had to find anything to disagree with, it would be the notion that you could put all the blame for something on one party, on one side, whether you call it 100 or 103. It's actually important to realize, both for reaching a negotiated settlement and for persuading people who don't already agree with you on everything, that there is a lot of blame to go around on every side. And that if you can't blame a country like Russia for invading a neighbor, who can you blame? How can you go on blaming the United States when it does that to other countries? I want to say a couple things about this city of Charlottesville. You know, we have worked with our city council over the years to pass resolutions that have inspired other cities around the United States and beyond to do the same, opposing wars in places like Iraq where they happened anyway, and Iran where they didn't, and Syria where they sort of did, and drones, and moving the money from militarism to human needs, influencing the council of mayors to do the same thing, divesting money. We got the city to take its money out of the weapons dealers, demilitarizing the police here in Charlottesville, etc. We're going to try to do the same thing with this war. We're going to ask the city council of Charlottesville to advance a resolution urging negotiation and ceasefire and eventual peace in Ukraine. And if you sign up on the sign-up sheets that are going around, you'll be informed of how to help make that happen. The other thing I want to mention is 200 years ago, this coming December 2nd, a local boy here in Charlottesville gave a speech. And in the years that followed, all the big media pundits and politicians took a little excerpt from that speech and they did it in marble and they lit it the eternal white phosphorus bombs, and they prayed to it before every shareholders meeting, and they called it the Monroe Doctrine. And they invented the doctrine. There's nothing in the Constitution that says presidents, much less newspapers, can invent a doctrine and call it law or something supreme above law. On the 100th anniversary of this thing, every kid in every school recited it. Into the thing. It was above the Declaration of Independence. Monroe had surpassed Jefferson. Right here we are, 200 years from the Monroe Doctrine, and half the political establishment abides by it, but swears they're against it, and the other half openly trumpets it. They're just openly for the Monroe Doctrine. What was the Monroe Doctrine? Well, half of it was the U.S. will stay out of Europe. We know what happened to that. The other half was the U.S. will do whatever it wants and nobody else better come mess around in this entire hemisphere. We'll deal with these other countries. Well, what happened to that? They expanded it to the whole globe. You know, when they created NATO and they had discussions back after World War II about creating NATO, one of the options that was pushed by some parties was, wouldn't it just be simpler to just say we're expanding the Monroe Doctrine to Europe? Well, they did that. They just went beyond that. They just created a military enterprise to uphold it. The thing about something like the Monroe Doctrine, you don't realize how insidious and dangerous it is until you think about what if there were two of them. Because the world may not survive one of them. But with Russia now acting like maybe it should have a little mini Monroe Doctrine for its area, you can imagine if various countries or groups or blocks of countries around the world said they were going to have a Monroe Doctrine. Well, we wouldn't survive. We just wouldn't survive it. And so what I'm proposing, and what a number of people and organizations and groups throughout this hemisphere are going to do on December 2nd, is have ceremonies to bury the thing. We're going to have funerals for the Monroe Doctrine. 200 years is enough. In fact, one of the books out in the hallway that I've written just recently is called The Monroe Doctrine at 200, and what to replace it with, because we have to replace it with something completely different. So let's stay in touch between now and December 2nd. Thank you.
I'm thinking that his work. Oh, okay. I don't have much to say, honestly. The only thing I want to say is something that we all learned in kindergarten, really, that like, he started it, she started it, they did it, they're responsible. No, the kindergarten teacher comes in and says, stop. And then we'll sort out the responsibility. And that's my approach in arguing for an armistice.
First of all, there are extra copies of this wonderful document in the back. I was one of the participants. It was a wonderful group of seminars, and I encourage each of you to take. They're only what, $50?
This will knock down the price of $5.
$5. All right. David and I agree on 95% of the things. We don't agree on the apportion of guilt with respect to what happened in Ukraine. What I would cite is what the Secretary General of NATO said on the 7th of September. He was speaking before the EU Parliament. And he said, you know, expansion of NATO. Putin didn't want to expand. He didn't want us to expand NATO. He gave us a treaty and said, look, we want you to sign this. And of course, we didn't sign it. And instead, 50 Finland join NATO and Sweden's gonna show what Putin wanted. He got exactly the opposite. How many of your American co-citizens know that? The head of NATO kind of bragged about the fact that, as he put it, the precondition for Russia not invading Ukraine was just to say, okay, we won't bring Ukraine into NATO. And of course, we didn't do that. He said, no, there's even more NATO at Russian border. Okay, well, you know, you can have the Monroe Doctrine work pretty well 61 years ago during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Why did it work? Because John Kennedy felt an existential threat from Soviet missiles in Cuba. And he said to Khrushchev, take them out, or we'll take them out. Okay? So when a great power feels an existential threat, this time 61 years later in Europe, Russia, Ukraine, and that's the kind of threat Putin feels, because the exact same kind of missiles with the exact same kind of time from launch to target could go down to 5 minutes, exists already in Romania and in Poland. And you guys probably didn't know that. You probably also didn't know that Biden promised Putin on the 30th of December not to put those kinds of missiles in Ukraine, and then reneged on that promise. That's documentary. That the reneging came 2 weeks before Russian troops went into Ukraine. My point is simply this. If I'm right, or even mostly right, maybe I'll take 100%. You don't need 103%, okay? But if I'm sort of right, well, Americans are smart enough to say, my God, I didn't know that. And it's our job to tell them, because they're not going to learn it in any other way, okay? And so this is really important to me. It seems to me if we can shock people, say, look, you were had on weapons of mass destruction. You were had that we could win in Afghanistan. You were had when we did lots of other things that we promised would come out well, and they didn't. So I agree with Helena. First thing you do, well, first thing you do in first aid, for God's sake, is you stop the bleeding, right? And I remember when I was 10 years old, my sister was older than me, and she said something very provocative. I assure you, my reaction was well warranted, and I took my hand like this, and I put my elbow through the kitchen. There was a glass kitchen door here, right? And my mother came in, and she looked at both of us, and she saw the gash in my elbow. And what'd she do? What'd she do? Anybody know? What? She stopped the bleeding. We had it out later on as to who was responsible and stuff. So Helen is exactly right. I mean, it's the basic principle. Right? People are dying and dying and dying. The US president has the ability to stop it. And he won't unless we make him do it. All the more so with election coming up, he's got some really crucial choices to make. I fear that he's going to make the wrong ones unless enough of us stand up and make a lot of noise. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Our next speaker is Medea.
I mentioned that we were going to do a sit-in in Bernie Sanders' office, and we've been trying to talk to him on a regular basis. And one of his responses is, you can't talk to Putin. And so we have been responding to that with a one-word answer, which is try, because Biden hasn't done anything to talk to Putin. And certainly there have been a lot of discussions, negotiations going on between Ukraine and Russia on particular issues such as the grain deal that was in effect until recently when Russia pulled out, and there's efforts right now to try to get that grain deal going again. There have been successful talks around the Zaporizhia nuclear plant when it looked like both sides were going to shell the plant, it was going to blow up, and talks to get representatives of the Atomic Energy Association into the plant. There have been talks and successful prisoner swaps of wounded soldiers, deceased soldiers going back to their home countries. And there have been talks on the whole issue of how to solve this problem. And we saw that very quickly after the Russian invasion, which the talks started at the end of March, beginning of April. And they were going extremely well, so well that there was a 15-point plan that included neutrality for Ukraine, meaning it wouldn't join NATO, meaning Russian troops would leave, that there would be new referendum internationally supervised for the Donbass, the issue of Crimea would be put off into the future until the UK and the US put a quash on that. And since then, they have been sabotaging all kinds of efforts and peace talks that the international community has been doing. We've seen, for example, the president of Brazil that tried to get involved as a mediator, the president of Mexico, 6 leaders of Africa led by the president of South Africa, the Pope, and most recently, the Chinese putting forth their peace plan. And the US has dismissed every one of them. Which is why when Anthony Blinken, our Secretary of State, who's supposed to be the ‌1 diplomat, was speaking before a hearing at Congress on diplomacy for the 2023-2024, we got up to interrupt him and say, you're supposed to be a diplomat. Where is your peace plan? If you don't like the Chinese one, where is your peace plan? And key question to be asking our representatives, where is your peace plan? And finally, I just want to say that one thing that really has been sped up by this war is, ironically, on the one hand, you have the message that NATO is stronger than ever, and certainly there are some indications that it is when you have Finland and Sweden joining NATO, when you have the European countries, especially Germany, saying they're pouring more money into weapons than they have before, strengthening the militarization of all of Europe. On the other hand, we see tremendous divisions that are happening within NATO, just beneath the surface. Even more most recently, something extremely surprising is Poland, that have been the greatest supporter of Ukraine, is now fighting with Ukraine and saying that they can't send any more of their grain into Poland because it's hurting Polish farmers. And Poland saying it doesn't want to send any more weapons into Ukraine. I mentioned that the Europeans are really suffering from the sanctions, and that's creating a lot of divisions and a lot of overturning of traditional parties in Europe. And worldwide, what we're seeing is a speeding up of a world that goes beyond the United States as being at, quote, the head of the table, US exceptionalism. We see the growth of the BRICS countries that now, with the addition of the 6 new members, represent more of the GDP than the G7 countries. We just saw a meeting of what's called the G77 plus China that took place in Cuba, a country that the US has been blockading for 60 years now, was now hosting heads of state from all over the world. We see trade in major commodities like energy being done now more in local currencies to get away from the dollar. And this is happening in our lifetimes. And I think we must recognize that the world community does not want to see one country, one superpower trying to run the world, because we've done such a bad job of it. And that we are now living in a multipolar world, which is not only good for the rest of the world, it's good for us here at home.
Yeah. So we're going to go into the question and answer period now. If you would like to ask a question, please direct it to one of our speakers. You have 1 minute to ask your question. Please, no speeches, just questions. Chip, tap to raise your hand. Chip, right over there, is going to come to you with the microphone. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, this question's for Ray. And it's about what Seymour Hersh has been writing about divisions within the intelligence community between the CIA and the CIA, intelligence agency. And that seems to me to be important. And I wonder if you could elaborate on possible ramifications of that are, like in terms of, don't senators like the Senate Intelligence Committee, they get reports from the intelligence committee, including CIA. How does this figure into the politics of this? Is there any way that the peace movement can exploit it?
Can you hear me okay? Okay. It's a really interesting question. The answer is kind of a disappointing one. It doesn't matter. I would use the analogy of Vietnam. I was back in the thick of it when my friends who were the analysts of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong told our director that there were twice as many Viet Cong under arms in South Vietnam as General Westmoreland would allow to be counted. And we had the whole community, the whole intelligence committee, only 15 at the time, okay, on board except the Army, because Westmoreland, of course, was in the Army. And we went to the director and we presented this with a national intelligence estimate and a good chance of stopping the war, of course, if we said this. But he said to us, now you have to understand, your figures are right, but my job is to protect the agency. And there's no way I can protect the CIA if I let it get involved in a pissing match with the US Army at war. So forget about it. And he went with Westmoreland's numbers, okay? 2 months, that was August. So several months later, January, February, came the Tet Offensive where 500,000, not 299,000 invaded the South. So what I'm saying here is that it depends on the Army when they're running these things, and the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has made a cottage industry of corrupting intelligence, starting when he was running CENTCOM in Tampa. He fills with the evidence, tells the president and the rest of the people, yeah, we can win this thing, and we can't, of course. Thanks very much.
My name is Dave Copper. This is addressed to Lydia. You mentioned Zaporizhzhia. What is the exact status there now? Who controls it? Still the same status quo? That to me is the greatest threat of all.
So it's controlled by Russia. There are Ukrainians who are working there, and there are staff members of the Atomic Energy Agency who are there as well. I wouldn't say in any way that it's a stable situation, but it is more stable than it was before the international agency was there. It's my understanding.
I could just add quickly, if you look at WorldBeyondWar.org/ZAP, you'll see the project we're working on. We have a team of people there now trying to create unarmed protection of the nuclear power plant and to allow the IAEA to do what it wants to do, which Russia will not allow and Ukraine will not allow. And the people of the town protected the thing unarmed from the Russians 4 days. And when they turned it over to the Ukrainian military, the Russians started shooting as soon as they had somebody with guns to shoot at. Never mind, they were shooting at a nuclear power plant. And so there is a value in unarmed protection that nobody wants to learn about. And you've got janitors dressed up as engineers. I mean, you've got scientists saying there's a 20% chance at growing of Fukushima at Zaporizhzhia. And it's one of the many disasters created by this war.
A quick addition. You may recall that before the summit in Vilnius, the NATO summit, there were lots of threats traded between the Ukrainians and the Russians of a false flag attack on Zaporizhzhia. Okay, but the Ukrainians say the Russians going to do it. The Russians said, no, this is a false flag attack. The Ukrainians were really pressing this thing, and all of a sudden they stopped about 2 days before the summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. And there were reports as to what happened. And what happened was NATO allies went to Zelensky and said, knock it off. Now wait a second, the Russians are going to do this. Everyone recognized this was a false flag sort of thing. It was the West Europeans and the East Europeans that went to Zelensky and said, look, we're not going to get suckered by this. This is just too important. The hardened facilities are one thing, but the pools with all this stuff in it, they could be hit, and that would be a minor collapse, not the kind of thing that happened before. But anyhow, that's the way it went down. And I found that really interesting because it was very clear who the false flag was being waged by, and it was the NATO partners that put the kibosh on it.
I want to introduce a different point of view. What we've been discussing so far has been very U.S. centric. Timothy Snyder, who's a historian with a lot of experience analyzing what's going on in Eastern Europe, sees this as a contest between autocracy and democracy. But even going deeper, the people who lived for decades under Soviet domination know the threat that Russia poses to the independence of the Baltic states or any of the other states. They fear a reassertion of Russian domination. And largely, they push from the bottom up to have their countries join NATO as soon as possible to defend themselves against Russian reassertion of dominance. Russia invaded Ukraine, which prompted Sweden and Finland to join NATO. My question, what are any people that you know doing to persuade Putin to withdraw his forces from Ukraine, which would end the war immediately?
Hi, Bob. I think it's, actually, I can use this. It's a good question that you ask, and it's one that people ask a lot. Timothy Snyder is a professional historian who has done a lot of work on these issues. A lot of other historians have also worked on these issues, including a wonderful guy who writes in the Financial Times and elsewhere called Anatol Lieven. Lieven has actually written a whole book about Russian-Ukrainian relations. He's written a book about Russia in Afghanistan. He's somebody who looks at the big picture. And he says, there's plenty of blame to go around, of course, as we know. But the thing is to stop the fighting and then have the discussions. So what you're proposing is that we reach out to President Putin and tell him, I mean, we, the citizens of this area, reach out to President Putin and tell him to withdraw his forces. He's not going to, for a number of reasons, including that the people of the Donbass and Crimea actually fear the Ukrainian army a lot. So he has what we in the West would call, a humanitarian imperative to protect them. These are complicated issues. The history of Ukraine is a complicated issue. So these things can be resolved through negotiation. As I said, those negotiations can take a long time, but Anatol Lieven, in this series of webinars that I actually organized and co-hosted with my friend Richard Paul, in which Medea and Gray both took part, along with 17 other experts, and that's why I think it's still worth reading this. Anatol Lieven was one of the experts. He put forward a really good plan for, you do this regarding Central Europe, and you do that regarding Ukrainian central government, and you have internationally supervised, monitored elections for the local authorities in the Donbass. So, it's very similar to what the US did in Bosnia or in South Sudan, where you try to look at the sovereignty issues and disaggregate them and come up with creative solutions. It all takes time. So I think, that's why we have to go for the ceasefire now, and that will allow people, maybe, the time to look at the big issues. And if the big issues don't get immediately resolved, South Korea is not too bad of a place to be. So anyway, do look at this. Do look at the work of Anatol Lieven. I know there are a lot of people in Baltic countries who have a lot of grievances. So those can all be addressed through, I would say, a demilitarization of all of Europe. Why should the world have to put up with all these little white tribes in Europe fighting each other and using up all the resources and stopping what we need, which is the fight against the climate crisis? The rest of the world.
Could not agree more. I just want to add, we've got lots of time, and it's a very important question from Bob, and I just want to add a few thoughts. I have met personally with a very high up Russian official, and I'm not allowed to say who, but you might or might not know who it was if I said, and I of course said, "And the day of war, get the hell out." What do you think I'm going to say? And I said, can you at least not do this? This was at the time when they were talking about putting nukes in Belarus. And I said, can you not do that? And he said, oh, no, it's okay. The United States has got nukes in 5 countries in Europe. It's okay. And I said, well, what is the end game here? How does this end? And he said, we're going to have regime change in Kiev. And I said, what are you talking about? This is madness. This is illegal. He said, no. Donald Rumsfeld said it was okay, so we're going to do it. This is what they do. They take the worst thing the other side has done and say, well, it's okay for us too. It's a synergistic madness. But I think it's important for us to remember that there are many, many Russians who tried to flee and get out of Russia and went to jail for protesting. And we did everything we could from abroad to support those people protesting in Russia and those people who fled. But many of them who fled started running out of money. They had to go back to Russia where they would be put into the war or go to jail. And the United States government, you would think, could have found pocket change from one of these weapons shipments and helped all these people not have to return to Russia and join the war. As a matter of fact, Russians who fled the war and come to the United States, the way sane people used to go to Canada to avoid killing Vietnamese, the United States is sending them back to Russia. Because if there's anything more important than crushing Russia, it's upholding the principle of the draft, you know? So there are things that could be done that aren't being done. And I think we should remember how the Soviet Union was kicked out of the Baltic states, because we all fantasize anachronistically that it had something to do with NATO. It was kicked out through nonviolent, unarmed action. That was incredibly impressive and successful. And governments like the Lithuanian government put in place departments of the government to train everybody in unarmed civilian resistance to invasion. And the militaries co-opted it and made it part of a military plan for defending Lithuania. But if you'll indulge me for 1 second, I think it's important to correct, or at least add to something that Ray said on this topic, because Kennedy did not say to Khrushchev, you take those missiles out or we'll take them out. Kennedy pretended he said that. Kennedy went to the media and told them he said that. Incredibly damaging. And we still have textbooks telling people he said that. What he actually said was, if you don't tell anybody, we'll take our missiles out of Turkey and Italy if you'll take your missiles out of Cuba. He did the same thing. He did the compromise. But he publicly pretended disastrously for history, for the lesson that should have been learned, that he did the stupid thing, right? And we're still going around telling each other to do the stupid thing. And before he did it, another member of the Soviet military saved all our lives. His name was Vasily Arkhipov, a sailor who said, no, I don't think I'll start a nuclear war. We're not going to be able to continue counting on having a Russian sailor every time we're about to destroy the world. We need a better plan than that.
Pick up on a couple of things, if I may.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
1 minute.
Okay. One minute. Okay, it's really important to be clear on Cuba. We have the Soviet archives now, after the revolution, after the Soviet Union fell apart. The deal was simply that Khrushchev and Kennedy, Kennedy promised not to invade Cuba. Khrushchev said, okay, I'll take the missiles out. On the sideline, Bobby talked with Dobrynin and said, look, we'll take our missiles out of Turkey as well. But don't say anything about this. This is not part of the deal, all right? We promise. We promised. There was nothing about this part of the deal. And in about 5 or 6 months, we took them out of Turkey. So it was both. But the overt deal that was agreed to from Khrushchev and from Kennedy, no invasion of Cuba, we take our missiles out. That's documented by all the papers. Timothy Snyder. Timothy Snyder is an unreconstructed neocon. When Amy Goodman asked me to talk about Ukraine, 3 weeks after the coup in Kiev, I raised the matter of the intercepted telephone conversation between Victoria Nuland and our ambassador in Kiev. I hope you know about that. Okay, it appeared on YouTube 2.5 weeks before the coup. So I said that, well, Professor Snyder, what do you think about that intercepted conversation, which shows that the coup was planned by the United States? And he said, what coup? So, you know, Snyder is corrupting the minds of a lot of people at Yale. He's not a serious historian. The last thing I'll say is that if you look at the need for demilitarization, as has been said just now, Europe was demilitarized. NATO was demilitarized. Why do you think NATO has no shells for its main artillery and tanks? 155 millimeter shells. Why? Because there was no threat from Russia to the Baltic states, to Ukraine, to anybody else, because the Soviet Union fell apart and there was no need to build these shells. What happened in 2014? The coup in Kiev, which we orchestrated. Did we build the shells then? No, we didn't build the shells then either. So, here we go. President Biden says, well, let's give them the shells that we have. And Secretary Austin said, we don't have any. So, you don't have to be a Vestal virgin to realize that when you come to the party, you should have oil or shells. Last thing I'll say is this: mother of all opportunities. Mother of all opportunity costs. That's what this is. That's what Ukraine is with respect to the real problem, climate change. This has been mentioned, and the inability of these key countries to work together, and the spewing of carbon dioxide and everything else by the main polluters, the armies, that is the mother of all opportunity costs, and that's a hidden but a very important cost to this report.
Thank you so much. This has been so thought-provoking. My question, I have to just preface it by saying, my daughter was married to a Ukrainian citizen of ethnic Russian origin. And his family, who are still in Yalta, say life is 10 times better under Russian control. Their pensions double, their infrastructure has increased. We have heard terrible stories how Zelensky has treated ethnic Russians, cut their newspapers, not allowed them to speak Russian, etc. The question is, what would the United States do if thousands upon thousands of their citizens were treated by another country that way? It's just something to think about. Excuse me? Who is your favorite? Oh, yeah. Who do you think would like to see? David? It's just something that crosses my mind about
the whole democracy autocracy thing is so absurd. I mean, if you can make arguments for a war, but you don't have to make them that ridiculous. Ukraine does not have elections. US Congress members and European Parliament members are begging Ukraine to put up some pretense of having elections. They banned opposition parties. They banned free speech. My friend is facing possibility of going to jail for what he says and what he thinks. If this is how you spread democracy, why not take all the money you're giving to Saudi Arabia and Egypt and dump it into the cause, but it's not. Democracy doesn't mean anything anymore. It doesn't mean some standard of human rights. It just means the US side. That's all it means. And it is important that Russia is denying people the right to free speech and the right to assemble and the right to organize and the right to conscientious objection. It's also important that Ukraine is denying people these rights. But I've been involved in the past 3 days in debates where two sides scream at each other about how undemocratic and abusive, on the one hand, Russia, on the other hand, Ukraine, and they're both right. But none of it justifies war. What would the United States do if we were deprived of rights? I mean, thus far, we would largely sit back and take it. But at some point, we push back, right? And at the moment, we still have some rights. But when Ray talks about the so-called intelligence, so-called community having information that is not allowed to put out there, they could if they had the rights of whistleblowers, but whistleblowers are punished in the United States. They're not thanked. They're not rewarded. If you speak out What you're not supposed to say is happening within the US government. You risk prison. Yes. There are members of the Parliament of Australia visiting the United States last week to say, please don't put an Australian in prison for doing journalism. Right? The Gustavo Petro, who Medea Benjamin quoted a minute ago, the president of Colombia, said at the United Nations last week, and said on Democracy Now, the United States came up with the idea of freedom of the press. What a wonderful idea. They should try using it. They should try practicing it. Because putting a man in prison for journalism is a threat to communications all over the world. If the United States can put somebody who's never come to the United States, not a US citizen, is not engaged in espionage for any other country, is just an Australian journalist for treason against the United States, well, then any country can put anybody it doesn't like anywhere on earth in prison for treason against their country, whether he or she has ever been there or not, or done anything against it or not. So, you know, we have some good and some bad in records of rights and defense thereof in the United States, but we need a lot more defense of what we've got left.
One good thing is that because the media is so biased, we have to raise a lot of money to take out ads in newspapers. And there's a group called the Eisenhower Media Project that took out this full page ad in the New York Times. And basically it's to say, and it says here, what if the shoe were on the other foot? And it tries to ask people to see things from the perspective of a country that's surrounded by US bases, surrounded by hostile military forces. And if anybody wants to read it, it's extremely well done. You can find it on the peaceinukraine.org website.
No, here, right here.
Hi, I'm an environmentalist, and I noticed one thing hasn't been talked about. And Ray and Medea and David and Helena, any one of you can answer this question. Who do you think blew up the dam and blew up the bridge in Crimea and isolated those people and destroyed their farms, destroyed animals, destroyed crops, and so on and so on?
One person.
I can tell you, because I have lived and worked and tried to raise a family in a situation of war, and that's something that not many people in this country, apart from fleeing wars in Central America, have had the experience of living and working in a country at war. And that is that the most basic pieces of infrastructure get really badly damaged. So, you know, you can look at, for example, what's been happening in Libya recently. Thank you, NATO, you know, for overthrowing Gaddafi and fomenting the civil war there. That meant that the two vital dams have not been inspected for the last 11 years, and the early warning systems don't exist. So, you know, it's women and children and old people and their caregivers who suffer most. In Afghanistan, all that fighting, you know, Afghanistan has historically very sophisticated water management systems with terracing on the mountains and canals, and all of that got bombed. Well, not all of it, but nearly all of it. And who suffered? You know, it's the families and women and the children and the communities. And so that's, you know, why you need to end the fighting. Sorry, I'm a Johnny one note, but really, the more you think about it, clearer it is.
My name is going to fuel this war, weapons from our country, keep fueling this war. In terms of strategy, political strategy, to respond to all this, I'm wondering, from the panelists as well as others perhaps, do you find yourself applauding the Republicans now? And should we be in a position of encouraging the Republicans who are raising questions about all the weapons going to the war? Should we start a movement, Democrats for Trump, Democrats for RFK Jr. as a way of raising this irony? I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
I mean, given that I'm going through the halls of Congress whenever I'm in Washington, D.C., it's a really important question. And I find that as I meet with Republicans and meet with members of their staff, I actually find a lot of them have very legitimate reasons for opposing this war. And this might be a difference that I have with David Swanson, for example, Rand Paul. He wrote a very good piece. Where was it? In the Guardian? No. An op-ed recently that talked about his reasons for opposing this war, and they were very good reasons. There is a congressperson from Tennessee, a very conservative congressperson, who I heard at a hearing, and he was really grilling the witnesses about this war. And I went up to him afterwards. His name is Tim Burchett from Tennessee. And I said, you know, what is your reason? And he said, I hate war. And then I asked him a little more, and he said, it's a racket. And he said, look at how many of these people on the Armed Services Committee and on the Foreign Affairs Committee have stocks in weapons companies, take money from weapons lobbyists. He said, it is a racket. And there is one congressperson who was from North Carolina, Walter Jones, who during the Iraq War was one of the ones we most disliked. He voted for the war, and he said because the French didn't go along with us in the war, we shouldn't serve French fries in the cafeteria. They had to be freedom fries. Well, as he went to the funerals of soldiers from his district, he changed his mind. And he became the most supportive, the most adamant anti-war person in the Republican Party. So I would say don't give up on these Republicans. There might be good reasons and there might be bad reasons, but as it stands now, we have to turn more of the Democrats along with us. We have to get the squad to speak out with us. We have to get Bernie Sanders. We have to get Barbara Lee. We have to make this a bipartisan effort that puts the pressure on the White House. It has to go beyond partisan. And let's remember that if there were a Republican in the White House, we would have those Democrats on our side. They would be speaking out. They're not doing it now because they see this as a partisan political issue, and that is wrong.
I just want to not disagree with anything you just said. I think we have to ignore party. We also have to ignore people. We have to stick with policy. And not only are there Democrats who support a war if the president is a Democrat, there are many Republicans who oppose a war if the president is a Democrat. And many of them oppose this war because they think it's more important to be focusing on a war with China, which is not what I want. Right. And so I want to applaud the policy within narrow borders of exactly what I agree with, but not what I disagree with. And I think people who are not in office and run their mouths without necessarily even much connection to their brain. I'm thinking perhaps of a previous president who wants to be president again. This is the guy who gave all the weapons to Ukraine when Obama wouldn't. This is the guy who threatened Russia, lied about Russia, kicked out the Russian diplomats, bombed the Russians in Syria, refused to do treaties with Russia, tore up treaties with Russia. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find someone more hostile toward Russia. And what did the opposition do? They claimed he was Putin's servant because he'd been peed on, right? And so I think we have to be careful about saying the answer is, backing some fascist buffoon for an election that's over a year away. When I agree, we have to support those Republicans, Democrats, whoever, who are saying, let's end the war for whatever reasons, good or bad. They want to end the war, but jumping to support, but the answer to not having that guy become president is not to run a guy who loses to him in all the polls, who's in charge of the war right now. This is another form of insanity.
Let me just add there quickly that, oh, okay.
I actually have a question. So, my name's Stephen Miller, and you kind of partially answered this question when you talked about the Eisenhower Media Network. I mean, when I'm reading mainstream media, I'm reading the Atlantic Council Institute for Study of War being quoted as authoritative sources. I mean, can you give us some other sources that might be reliable and useful and maybe have another impact and position on this? Then my other question is, you mentioned you're working with faith-based communities, you're working with mayors, Congress. Are you working with the media to try to influence them, to broaden the base of sources?
Yeah, it's an absolutely critical question. I mean, David held this out, but I do want to say it's a good primer book. And if you feel like you need some more elements for this discussion, or you feel like you have friends and relatives that ought to get this, it's a good source, and I think quite a balanced one. In terms of other media, we could probably come up and I think it would be good to hear from other people where you think you are getting good sources of media. Anybody want to throw out your ideas? Where are you getting? Democracy Now? Yeah. Antiwar.com. Al Jazeera is not very good on Ukraine, but it's good on other things. Yeah.
I mean, it's like counter-current, anti-war, it's a couple of other websites. On YouTube, right? My Sri Lankan and Indisamara writes on Medium.
So she's saying that on Medium, on Substack, there are websites like Common Dreams, like Counterpunch, like antiwar.com, like World Beyond War, Popular Resistance, Code Pink,
Gray Zone.
Gray Zone,
Consortium News.
Consortium News,
Yeah, think about that.
William Alabama, Naked Capitalism. So right. I think one of the best ones is the Quincy Institute, because it's a coming together of left and right, and they actually have a lot of good things on this, and they're seen as reliable. The media will quote them. So I think they have a lot of good webinars as well. So if you haven't heard of them, you might want to take a look at the Quincy Institute. And then the last part of your question is, what are we doing to try to change the media? Well, I mentioned that we have these committees as part of Peace in Ukraine, and you can join Peace in Ukraine as an individual as well as an organization. And we have a great media group. I love them because every day they are taking mainstream media and a little bit less mainstream media, and they're responding to them. and with great responses. They get letters to the editor all the time. And then we have campaigns like the one I mentioned, responding to the piece that came out of PBS yesterday to say this is a propaganda piece. We demand that you have a different point of view. So if you're interested in the media, you might want to join the media committee at peaceofukraine.org.
Hi, my name is Brian King. I have a question for Mr. Sawyer. And it's Swanson, I'm sorry. Mr. Swanson, it has to do with the wars throughout the ages. Wasn't there a war called the 100 Years' War? So what makes this any different? And is this just a state of sad humanity? And lastly, and this is speculative, how long do you think this could continue, given the fact that we don't have a draft in the United States? We have a huge war machine that profits up. Yeah, so it doesn't seem reined in.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. The thing about blaming humanity, you have to wonder the millions of people who are doing their best to flee Russia and Ukraine and avoid the war. Are they hippopotamuses? Are they orangutans? What are they? Humanity, most people who have ever existed have done everything they could, and successfully, to avoid having anything to do with war. Most of the existence of our species as hunter-gatherer tribes had nothing that remotely resembled modern war, if war at all. In recorded history, various societies have gone for millennia and centuries without war at all. And they haven't suffered. You can survey the hospitals of the world, and they have yet to record the first case of any sort of illness or trauma from war deprivation. But almost everybody who takes part in war suffers horribly. Even people who take part in it from thousands of miles away, just pushing a button, suffer horribly. And so I don't think there's actually an identifiable meaning to saying that something is natural or something is humanity or something is human nature. I think it's meaningless. But if anything is natural humanity, it's not war. It can't possibly be war. And it's disturbing that we have these history books that jump from war to war, leaving out the decades of peace in between and persuading everybody that war is just constant and normal and unavoidable. And we have these channels of movies on our computers where you can look through the hundreds of choices, but you can't find any that aren't people killing each other. Yet there have been societies in our lifetime where anthropologists have visited and shown them the Hollywood movies and the cartoons that kids watch in Western society. They've been horrified. They've wanted nothing to do with it. And they've been unable to even conceive of war or even murder, unable to even think it. And we're unable to unthink it. And so if it's not humanity, and if 96% of humanity is represented by governments that invest dramatically less in war than this 4%, maybe we have to blame something smaller. Maybe we have to blame ourselves or our government or something a little more controllable, over which we have a little more responsibility than passing the buck to humanity.
David, we only have time for one more question, please. Yes.
I'd like to ask Elena, if we go to an armistice or put on a hypothetical hat, where would it start? Right?
That's a good question, because I think it's important for us all to think through the diplomatic options rather than just be subject to all the media barrage that we have about the military options, military this, military that. So I'll just quickly go back to what I was saying about 1916, when the Germans, British, and French all reached out to President Woodrow Wilson to mediate, to come forward with a peace plan. And actually, this has recently been discovered by UVA's very own historian, Phil Zellicoe, who's written a great book about this. Nobody knew about this until Phil, I guess a German researcher, tipped Phil Zellicoe off, and then he did the archival research and published a great book about it. Woodrow Wilson dropped the ball. It was 1916, I guess there was an election. The trouble with a democracy, honestly, I have to say, is that they keep having the elections that upset diplomacy. I mean, you know, I've seen that in the Middle East how many times? I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Golda, about how Golda couldn't engage in diplomacy because of her election. And prior to that, Nixon couldn't engage in diplomacy because of his election. I mean, we have a real problem here, but he dropped the ball. And what happened after that in World War I was, you know, just horrendous, including, you know, many of the worst trench battles of northern France and the Russian Revolution, and this and that and the next thing. Instead of which, the Americans decided to join the war on one side, came in and imposed a peace on Germany, and we know how what that led to. Not a great plan. So now, I think we need some external person, being, organization, body, to come and propose a ceasefire. And I have no doubt but what this is happening, that whether it's the Pope, whether it's the government of Switzerland, whether it's the government of China, whether it's some body within the BRICS organization, that they are trying to find a way to launch a peace initiative. It would be great if the Secretary General of the UN did it. And if it's going to get legs, it has to have the UN behind it. I think the government of Switzerland may have been trying for some months now to do this. And just come forward, let's have the ceasefire. Let's have the armistice. Now, negotiating an armistice is not an easy thing. In Korea, it took 2 years until these three effective parties, were ready to sign the armistice. But I think in the present circumstances, given the presence of the nuclear weapons environment, given the urgency of the climate crisis issue, and given the fact that, honestly, the West is running out of artillery shells, that this may happen much faster than 2 years. But let's hope that somebody is doing it, and we as American citizens should be really pulling for the effort and supporting any move toward a total armistice in Ukraine.
Thank you. The problem is it's 9 o'clock and we promised that the church we have to end at 9 o'clock.
So I've not been allowed to speak now for 20 minutes. The embargo still stands.
Yeah, time for people outside. Let me just say real quickly that we have books for sale outside that you can buy. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't know there was an embargo, but it's just we have a contract with the church till 9 o'clock. It's after 9 o'clock now. So all of our speakers will be selling books out in the lobby if you'd like to buy a book, and they can sign it for you. Also, we have water and chocolate outside. Help yourself. Thank you all for coming.